Picture this: a world where the dead could be brought back to life through the power of prayer, where the stars directly controlled human destiny, and where a single drop of saints' blood could cure any disease. A world where learned scholars debated whether women had souls, where kings ruled by divine appointment, and where the very air itself was thought to carry moral corruption. This was not a world of primitive savages stumbling through darkness. This was medieval Europe, a civilization that built cathedrals that still inspire awe, developed complex legal systems, and created universities that endure to this day. Yet the beliefs that govern daily life in what we call the Dark Ages seem so alien, so incomprehensible to modern minds, that we dismiss them as mere superstition. But here lies our fundamental error. We have been conditioned to see medieval beliefs as crazy because we judge them through the lens of modern scientific understanding. We laugh at the idea that personality was determined by bodily fluids, that barnacle geese grew on trees, or that the earth was the center of the universe. We shake our heads at trial by ordeal, at the belief in unicorns, at the conviction that bathing was dangerous to one's health. Yet these beliefs were not the products of ignorance or stupidity. They were the rational conclusions of intelligent people working within a completely different framework of understanding, a framework that prioritized divine revelation over empirical observation, that saw the world as a vast moral allegory, rather than a collection of natural phenomena, and that valued authority and tradition over individual inquiry. The medieval worldview was not crazy. It was coherent, systematic, and internally logical. It provided answers to every question, comfort in every crisis, and meaning in every suffering. It was a complete explanation of existence that satisfied both intellectual curiosity and emotional need. The fact that it was wrong, spectacularly wrong about almost everything, does not make it any less remarkable as a human achievement. This is the story of how an entire civilization convinced itself of things that seem impossible to believe. It is the story of how faith, fear, and a desperate human need for certainty combined to create a worldview so compelling that it dominated European thought for nearly 1,000 years. It is the story of beliefs so deeply held that people were willing to die for them, to kill for them, to organize their entire lives around them. But this is also the story of how we became who we are. Medieval beliefs did not simply vanish with the Renaissance. They evolved, transformed, and in many cases, persist today in forms we barely recognize. The same human impulses that led medieval people to believe in the curative power of relics drive modern people to believe in the healing power of crystals. The same need for cosmic order that made medieval scholars insist on the celestial spheres makes modern people find meaning in astrology. The study of medieval beliefs is not an exercise in historical curiosity. It is a mirror held up to the human condition itself. It reveals the eternal tension between what we know and what we need to believe, between the world as it is and the world as we wish it were. It shows us that the line between rational thought and wishful thinking is far thinner than we like to admit. Medieval people believed these things not because they were gullible or primitive, but because they were human. They faced the same fundamental questions that we face. Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? How should we live? What is our place in the universe? The answers they found were different from ours, but the questions were the same. The needs were the same. The yearning for certainty, for meaning, for hope, these were the same. This is not a story about the triumph of reason over superstition. It is a story about the enduring power of belief to shape reality. It is about how what we believe determines what we see, how we act, and who we become. It is about the dangerous seduction of absolute certainty and the uncomfortable necessity of doubt. The Dark Ages were not dark because people were ignorant. They were dark because people were so certain of their ignorance that they mistook it for knowledge. They were dark because a civilization became so convinced of its own righteousness that it stopped asking questions. They were dark because people preferred the comfort of false certainty to the discomfort of honest uncertainty. But they were also bright with human creativity, ingenuity, and the indomitable spirit that drives people to seek answers even when uncertain. The questions are too large for human comprehension. The beliefs of the Dark Ages were wrong, but they were magnificently, brilliantly, audaciously wrong. They were the product of minds that refused to accept mystery, that insisted on explanation, that demanded meaning even in the face of chaos. This is their story. This is our story. This is the story of what happens when brilliant people believe terrible things, and how those terrible things can sometimes lead to unexpected truth. The world did not become medieval overnight. The beliefs that would dominate European thought for nearly a millennium emerged from the smoking ruins of the greatest empire the world had ever known. When the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed in 476 CE, he took with him not just political authority, but an entire way of understanding the world. Roman civilization had been built on practical materialism. Roman engineers built roads, aqueducts, and buildings that still stand. Today, Roman lawyers created legal systems that form the foundation of modern jurisprudence. Roman administrators governed an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman scholars preserved and transmitted the learning of Greece, Egypt, and the Near East. But Roman pragmatism had also been Roman limitation. The empire was magnificent at organizing the material world, but it offered little comfort to the human soul. Roman religion was largely a matter of civic duty rather than personal salvation. Roman philosophy was sophisticated but cold. Roman society was hierarchical and often brutal. For all its achievements, the Roman Empire was not a place where ordinary people could find meaning, purpose, or hope. This spiritual vacuum was filled by Christianity, which offered everything that Roman materialism lacked. Where Rome promised order, Christianity promised salvation. Where Rome offered citizenship, Christianity offered eternal life. Where Rome demanded obedience, Christianity offered love. Where Rome was concerned with this world, Christianity was focused on the next, the triumph of Christianity over Roman. Paganism was not just a religious revolution, it was an intellectual revolution. The Christian worldview was fundamentally different from the Roman worldview in every conceivable way. Where Romans saw the world as a collection of natural phenomena, to be understood and controlled, Christians saw it as a moral allegory to be interpreted and transcended. Where Romans valued empirical observation, Christians valued divine revelation. Where Romans trusted human reason, Christians emphasized faith. This transformation was not immediate or complete. The process of Christianization took centuries and involved countless compromises, adaptations, and innovations. Early Christian thinkers like Augustine of Hippo and Jerome of Stridon had to reconcile biblical teachings with classical learning, Christian morality with practical governance, and spiritual aspirations with earthly realities. Augustine's City of God, written in response to the sack of Rome in 410 CE, provided the intellectual framework for medieval civilization. Augustine argued that there were two cities, the earthly city of human ambition and the heavenly city of divine grace. The earthly city was temporary, corrupt, and ultimately meaningless. The heavenly city was eternal, perfect, and the only true reality. This dualistic worldview would dominate medieval thought for centuries. The collapse of Roman political authority created a power vacuum that was filled by the Christian Church. Bishops became civil administrators. Monasteries became centers of learning. The Pope became a temporal ruler. But more importantly, the Church became the sole interpreter of reality. In the absence of secular schools, Christian doctrine became the foundation of all education. In the absence of secular law, Christian morality became the basis of all justice. In the absence of secular governance, Christian hierarchy became the model for all authority. This was not a hostile takeover, but a gradual process of cultural transformation. The Church did not destroy classical learning, it preserved it. Monasteries maintained libraries, copied manuscripts, and kept alive the works of Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, and countless others. But they preserved this learning within a Christian framework, interpreting it through Christian principles and subordinating it to Christian purposes. The rise of feudalism further transformed the intellectual landscape. Feudal society was hierarchical, personal, and based on mutual obligation. Knowledge was not a commodity to be traded, but a privilege to be granted. Learning was not a tool for understanding the world, but a means of serving God and Lord. The feudal system created a closed intellectual world where innovation was discouraged. Questioning was dangerous and conformity was rewarded. But the medieval world was not as closed as it might seem. The Viking Age, which lasted from roughly 793 to 1066 CE, brought Europeans into contact with cultures as far away as Greenland and Constantinople. Viking traders and raiders created networks of exchange that transmitted not just goods but ideas, technologies, and beliefs. The Vikings themselves were not just barbarian marauders but sophisticated navigators, skilled craftsmen, and complex thinkers with their own rich mythology and worldview. Even more important was the Islamic Golden Age, which preserved and expanded upon the learning of the ancient world while medieval Europe was struggling to maintain basic literacy. Islamic scholars translated Aristotle into Arabic, developed algebra and algorithm, made advances in medicine and astronomy, and created philosophical systems that would eventually transform European thought. The contrast between Islamic intellectual achievement and European intellectual stagnation was stark and would eventually prove impossible to ignore. The Crusades, beginning in 1095, brought Europeans into direct contact with Islamic civilization and exposed them to levels of learning and sophistication that they had forgotten existed. Crusaders returned home with new ideas about mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and technology. They brought back Arabic texts, Islamic inventions, and Eastern customs that would gradually transform European society. The medieval world was also shaped by practical necessities. The collapse of long-distance trade meant that communities had to become self-sufficient. The absence of strong central authority meant that local lords had to provide their own security. The prevalence of violence meant that survival often depended on physical strength and military skill. These conditions created a society that valued hierarchy, tradition, and conformity over innovation, questioning, and change. But perhaps most importantly, the medieval world was shaped by the constant presence of death. Life expectancy was short, perhaps 30 years on average. Infant mortality was high. Disease was endemic. Famine was common. Violence was routine. In a world where death could come at any moment, the promise of eternal life was not just comforting but essential. The Christian emphasis on the afterlife was not abstract theology but practical psychology. This constant proximity to death also created a culture obsessed with meaning. When life is short and uncertain, every moment must have significance. When death is always near, every action must serve a purpose. When suffering is inevitable, it must be justified. Medieval beliefs provided this meaning, this purpose, this justification. They transformed a harsh and unpredictable world into a moral drama, where every hardship had meaning and every sacrifice had reward. The intellectual foundations of medieval civilization were thus laid not in isolation but in response to specific historical circumstances. The beliefs that would dominate European thought for centuries were not arbitrary superstitions, but rational responses to real challenges. They were the products of brilliant minds working within severe constraints, trying to make sense of a world that often seemed senseless. This is the world in which medieval beliefs were born. It was a world of faith and fear, of certainty and confusion, of magnificent achievement and terrible suffering. It was a world that needed answers, demanded meaning, and refused to accept mystery. The beliefs it created were the beliefs of people who could not afford to doubt, who could not tolerate uncertainty, who could not live without hope. The medieval worldview did not emerge from a vacuum but from the crucible of cultural collision. When Christianity began its conquest of the Roman Empire, it encountered not just political resistance but intellectual opposition from some of the most sophisticated philosophical traditions the world had ever known. The synthesis that emerged from this encounter would define European thought for the next 1,000 years. The early church fathers faced an enormous challenge. How could they reconcile the simple teachings of a Jewish carpenter with the complex philosophical systems of Plato and Aristotle? How could they make Christianity intellectually respectable to educated Romans while maintaining its appeal to the common people? How could they create a coherent worldview that satisfied both reason and faith? Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, provided the most influential answer. Augustine had been trained in classical rhetoric and philosophy before his conversion to Christianity. He understood both worlds intimately and was uniquely positioned to bridge them. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He argued that reason and faith were not opposed but complementary. Reason could take humans part of the way to truth, but only faith could complete the journey. Augustine's Confessions established the intellectual framework for medieval Christianity. He argued that all human knowledge was ultimately dependent on divine illumination. The human mind, corrupted by original sin, could not achieve true understanding through its own efforts. Only through God's grace could humans perceive reality as it truly was. This doctrine of divine illumination would dominate medieval epistemology for centuries. But Augustine did more than just reconcile reason and faith. He created a comprehensive theory of reality that would influence every aspect of medieval thought. According to Augustine, the material world was merely a shadow of eternal truth. Physical objects were significant only insofar as they pointed toward spiritual realities. The visible world was a book written by God, and every natural phenomenon was a symbol to be interpreted. This symbolic understanding of reality was revolutionary. Where classical thinkers had seen the world as a collection of things to be analyzed and understood, Augustine saw it as a collection of signs to be interpreted and transcended. Where classical science had sought to understand how things worked, Augustinian thought sought to understand what things meant. Jerome of Stridon, Augustine's contemporary, made an equally important contribution by translating the Bible into Latin. The Vulgate Bible became the standard text of medieval Christianity and shaped the way Europeans understood everything from history to natural science. Jerome's translation was not just a linguistic exercise but an interpretive one. He made choices about how to render Hebrew and Greek concepts into Latin that would influence European thought for centuries. The synthesis of Christian and classical thought was further developed by Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century. Gregory was not primarily a theologian but a practical administrator who understood that Christianity had to work in the real world. His pastoral care established the principles of Christian leadership that would guide medieval rulers for centuries. More importantly, his dialogues popularized the idea that the saints could intercede with God on behalf of ordinary believers. Gregory's contribution to medieval thought was his emphasis on the practical application of Christian principles. Where Augustine had been concerned with theological theory, Gregory was concerned with Christian practice. He established the framework for medieval monasticism, medieval liturgy, and medieval governance. His vision of a Christian society permeated every aspect of medieval life. But the medieval worldview was not just the product of Christian theology. It was also shaped by the practical necessities of governing a largely illiterate population. In a violent and uncertain world, the Church had to create a system of belief that could be understood by peasants and scholars alike, that could provide comfort in times of crisis, and that could justify the existing social order. The concept of the great chain of being, which would dominate medieval thought, was the perfect solution to this challenge. According to this theory, all of creation was arranged in a hierarchical order from God at the top to inanimate matter at the bottom. Every being had its proper place in this hierarchy, and every relationship was governed by divine law. At top of the chain was God, perfect and eternal. Below God were the angels, arranged in their own hierarchy of seraphim, cherubim, and various other orders. Below the angels were humans, with the Pope at the top, followed by kings, nobles, clergy, and common people. Below humans were animals, with the lion as the king of beasts, followed by other animals in order of their perceived nobility. Below animals were plants, with the oak as the king of trees. At the bottom were minerals and inanimate objects. This hierarchical understanding of reality was not just a philosophical theory, but a practical guide to life. It explained why some people were rich and others poor, why some were powerful and others weak, why some were learned and others ignorant. It provided a cosmic justification for social inequality and political authority. It made rebellion not just dangerous but sinful. The great chain of being also provided a framework for understanding the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. According to medieval thinkers, every physical object had a spiritual counterpart. Every earthly hierarchy reflected a heavenly hierarchy. Every human institution mirrored a divine institution. The visible world was a reflection of the invisible world, and by understanding one, humans could understand the other. This symbolic understanding of reality was reinforced by the medieval system of education. The cathedral schools that emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries were not primarily concerned with teaching practical skills, but with interpreting divine truth. Students learned grammar, rhetoric, and logic not to understand the world, but to understand God's Word. They studied arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music not to master the material world, but to glimpse the divine harmony that underlay it. The trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic provided the tools for interpreting scripture and tradition. The quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music revealed the mathematical order that God had imposed on creation. Together, these 7 liberal arts constituted the complete education necessary for understanding reality. But medieval education was not just about intellectual training. It was also about moral formation. Students learned not just what to think, but how to live. They were taught that knowledge without virtue was dangerous, that learning without humility was sinful, that intellectual pride was the root of all error. This moral emphasis shaped every aspect of medieval intellectual life. The rise of the universities in the 12th and 13th centuries marked a new phase in the development of medieval thought. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Europe had institutions dedicated to higher learning. The University of Bologna, founded around 1088, specialized in law. The University of Paris, founded around 1150, specialized in theology. The University of Oxford, founded around 1167, provided a more general education. These universities created a new class of professional intellectuals who could devote their lives to the pursuit of knowledge. But they also created new problems. How could individual inquiry be reconciled with institutional authority? How could innovation be encouraged without threatening orthodoxy? How could reason be used to support faith without undermining it? The scholastic method that emerged in the universities was designed to address these challenges. Scholastic thinkers like Peter Abelard, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas developed techniques for using reason to explore faith, for asking difficult questions without threatening established answers, for pursuing knowledge without abandoning authority. The scholastic method was based on the principle that truth was one and indivisible. Since both reason and revelation came from God, they could not contradict each other. If there appeared to be a conflict between philosophy and theology, it was because human understanding was incomplete, not because truth was contradictory. The task of the scholastic was to resolve these apparent contradictions and demonstrate the ultimate harmony of all knowledge. This intellectual optimism was characteristic of the high medieval period. Thinkers like Aquinas believed that human reason, properly guided by divine grace, could understand the fundamental structure of reality. They believed that natural philosophy and revealed theology were complementary approaches to the same truth. They believed that the material world and the spiritual world were parts of a single, coherent system, but this optimism was built on foundations that were already beginning to crack. The translation of Aristotle's complete works into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries introduced European thinkers to ideas that were difficult to reconcile with Christian doctrine. Aristotle's emphasis on empirical observation, his belief in the eternity of the world, and his purely naturalistic explanations of natural phenomena challenged fundamental Christian assumptions. The Islamic commentaries on Aristotle, particularly those of Averroes, made the problem even more acute. Averroes argued that reason and faith belong to different realms and that philosophical truth might be different from theological truth. This doctrine of double truth was condemned by Christian authorities, but it raised questions that would not go away. The synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology achieved by Aquinas was magnificent, but it was also precarious. It required constant vigilance to maintain the balance between reason and faith, between natural philosophy and revealed theology, between human inquiry and divine authority. The medieval worldview was not just a collection of beliefs, but a carefully constructed system that could be undermined by a single, loose thread. This was the intellectual world in which medieval beliefs were born. It was a world that valued synthesis over analysis, authority over innovation, and harmony over accuracy. It was a world that believed truth was available to human reason, but insisted that reason must be guided by faith. It was a world that saw reality as a unified whole, but understood that whole in terms of hierarchy, symbolism, and divine purpose. The beliefs that emerged from this world were not arbitrary superstitions but logical conclusions, drawn from widely accepted premises. They were the products of some of the most brilliant minds in human history, working within a framework that made perfect sense to them and their contemporaries. The fact that this framework was fundamentally flawed does not diminish the intellectual achievement of those who worked within it. The medieval worldview might have remained a purely theoretical construct, confined to the writings of theologians and philosophers, had it not been tested and refined by the great crises of the medieval period. The beliefs that would define European civilization for centuries were not formed in the calm of scholarly debate, but in the crucible of historical upheaval. The Crusades, beginning with Pope Urban II's call to arms in 1095, represented the first great test of medieval Christendom's understanding of itself and its place in the world. The Crusades were not just military campaigns but spiritual adventures. grand experiments in applying Christian principles to international politics. They were based on the revolutionary idea that violence could be holy, that killing could be a form of worship, that war could be a path to salvation. This concept of holy war required a fundamental revision of Christian thinking. The early church had been pacifist, following Christ's injunction to turn the other cheek. But the medieval church faced a different world, one where Christian communities were under attack from Vikings, Muslims, and Magyars. The doctrine of just war, developed by Augustine and refined by later thinkers, provided the theological framework for Christian violence, but the Crusades went beyond just war. They represented the militarization of pilgrimage, the weaponization of devotion. Crusaders were not just soldiers but pilgrims, not just warriors but penitents. They wore the cross as a badge of honor and fought with the zeal of martyrs. The idea that war could be a spiritual exercise, that violence could be a form of prayer, was revolutionary and would have profound consequences for medieval thought. The Crusades also brought Europeans into direct contact with Islamic civilization, which preserved and expanded upon the learning of the ancient world. Crusaders encountered libraries, universities, hospitals, and technologies that far surpassed anything in Europe. They discovered that the infidels they had come to fight were often more learned, more sophisticated, and more tolerant than they were themselves. This encounter forced medieval Europeans to confront uncomfortable questions about their own civilization. How could God's chosen people be so backward compared to his enemies? How could Christian truth be less effective than Muslim error? How could the righteous be weaker than the wicked? These questions would torment medieval thinkers for centuries and would ultimately lead to fundamental changes in European thought. The translations of Arabic texts that resulted from the Crusades introduced Europeans to Aristotle's complete works, to Islamic philosophy and science, and to the mathematical and technological innovations of the Islamic world. This flood of new knowledge created both opportunity and crisis. It provided tools for understanding the natural world that were far superior to anything Europeans possessed, but it also challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between Christianity and learning. The Black Death, which struck Europe in 1347, represented an even more severe test of medieval beliefs. The plague killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population, devastating cities, countryside, and institutions alike. It was a catastrophe so complete, so arbitrary, so devastating that it called into question every assumption about divine justice, human virtue, and the meaning of existence. Medieval people had a coherent theory of disease that linked physical illness to spiritual corruption. According to this theory, disease was punishment for sin, and the righteous could expect to be protected by divine grace. The Black Death made a mockery of this theory. It killed the pious and the wicked with equal ruthlessness. It devastated monasteries and brothels alike. It respected neither social rank nor spiritual merit. The plague forced medieval people to confront the possibility that their understanding of divine justice was fundamentally flawed. Some responded by intensifying their devotion, assuming that their sins were greater than they had realized. Others responded by abandoning traditional morality, reasoning that if virtue provided no protection, vice might as well be indulged. Still others responded by seeking scapegoats, blaming Jews, heretics, or foreigners for God's wrath. The flagellant movement, which emerged during the plague years, represented the extreme of religious response. Flagellants believed that by inflicting physical punishment on themselves, they could atone for the sins that had brought the plague upon the world. They traveled from city to city, whipping themselves bloody while calling on God for mercy. Their movement was eventually condemned by the Church, but it revealed the desperation of people whose traditional beliefs could not explain their suffering. the plague also had profound economic and social consequences that challenged medieval beliefs about social hierarchy and divine order. The massive death toll created labor shortages that empowered surviving workers to demand higher wages and better conditions. The traditional feudal system, based on the assumption that peasants were bound to the land by divine decree, began to break down as serfs fled to cities or demanded their freedom. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was a direct consequence of these changes. The rebels, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, challenged not just economic arrangements but the entire social order. Ball's famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" struck at the heart of medieval beliefs about natural hierarchy and divine appointment. The Viking Age, which overlapped with the early medieval period, presented a different kind of challenge to emerging medieval beliefs. The Vikings were not just raiders but explorers, traders, and colonizers who created networks of contact that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. Their raids on Christian Europe were not just military attacks but cultural confrontations that forced Christians to confront the power and sophistication of pagan culture. Viking culture was based on very different assumptions about the relationship between humans and the divine. Where Christianity emphasized humility, Vikings celebrated heroism. Where Christianity promised salvation in the afterlife, Vikings saw glory in this life. Where Christianity valued peace, Vikings honored warfare. Where Christianity emphasized universal brotherhood, Vikings celebrated tribal loyalty. The Viking raids forced Christian communities to confront the apparent contradiction between their beliefs and their experience. If God protected the faithful, why were Christian communities so vulnerable to pagan attacks? If Christian virtue was superior to pagan vice, why were the Vikings so successful? If divine providence governed the world, why did the wicked prosper, while the righteous suffered? The eventual conversion of the Vikings to Christianity was seen as vindication of Christian truth, but it also required significant adaptations of Christian doctrine. The Christianization of warrior culture required new concepts of holy war, sanctified violence, and militant virtue. The conversion of a merchant people required new ideas about the relationship between spiritual and material prosperity. The integration of a deeply hierarchical society required new justifications for social inequality. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 represented another crucial moment in the development of medieval beliefs. The Normans were descendants of Vikings, who had been Christianized and Gallicized, but they retained many of their ancestral characteristics. They were warriors, administrators, and builders who combined military prowess with institutional sophistication. The conquest created a new kind of medieval society that blended Anglo-Saxon, Norman, and ecclesiastical elements. The Norman elite imposed their own concepts of feudalism, chivalry, and royal authority on English society. They built castles, cathedrals, and administrative systems that would define English civilization for centuries. But the conquest also created new problems. How could the Norman claim to rule England be justified? How could the displacement of the Anglo-Saxon elite be reconciled with Christian principles of justice? How could the brutal realities of conquest be squared with the ideals of Christian kingship? These questions required new theories of political authority, new concepts of divine right, and new understanding of the relationship between power and morality. The rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries represented a more gradual but equally important catalyst for the development of medieval beliefs. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Europe had institutions dedicated to higher learning. These universities created a new class of professional intellectuals who could devote their lives to the pursuit of knowledge. The universities also created new challenges for traditional authority. How could individual inquiry be reconciled with institutional orthodoxy? How could new ideas be explored without threatening established truths? How could reason be used to support faith without undermining it? The scholastic method that emerged in response to these challenges would define European intellectual life for centuries. The founding of the University of Paris around 1150 was particularly significant because it became the center of theological education for all of Europe. The theological faculty at Paris had the authority to determine what was orthodox and what was heretical, what could be taught and what must be condemned. The debates that took place at Paris influenced the development of Christian doctrine throughout the medieval period. The translation movement of the 12th and 13th centuries was another crucial catalyst for the development of medieval beliefs. The systematic translation of Arabic and Greek texts into Latin introduced European thinkers to a vast body of knowledge that had been lost to the West since the fall of Rome. Works by Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, and many others became available to European scholars for the first time in centuries. These translations created both opportunities and challenges. They provided tools for understanding the natural world that were far superior to anything Europeans possessed, but they also contained ideas that were difficult to reconcile with Christian doctrine. The integration of this new knowledge into Christian thought required careful selection, creative interpretation, and sometimes outright rejection of classical authorities. The rise of the Mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, and the Paudvemenicans, 13th century represented another important development in medieval thought. These orders were founded specifically to address the spiritual needs of the emerging urban populations that were growing rapidly throughout Europe. Unlike the traditional monastic orders, which withdrew from the world, the mendicants engaged with it. The mendicants were particularly important in the development of medieval beliefs because they were both scholars and preachers. They taught in the universities and preached in the streets. They were responsible for much of the scholastic synthesis of the 13th century, but they also had to make this synthesis accessible to ordinary people. The result was a new form of Christianity that was both intellectually sophisticated and emotionally accessible. These catalyst events did not occur in isolation but reinforced and influenced each other. The Crusades brought Europeans into contact with Islamic learning, which influenced the development of the universities, which in turn shaped the way Europeans understood their faith, their society, and their world. The Black Death challenged traditional beliefs about divine justice, which opened the door for new ideas about the relationship between God and humanity. The result was a worldview that was constantly evolving, constantly adapting to new challenges and new information. Medieval beliefs were not static superstitions but dynamic responses to changing circumstances. They were the products of some of the most creative and innovative minds in human history, working within constraints that we can barely imagine. But these beliefs were also shaped by the very events that challenged them. The Crusades, which began as expressions of medieval Christian certainty, ultimately introduced doubts about that certainty. The universities, which were founded to defend orthodoxy, became centers of questioning and debate. The Black Death, which was interpreted through traditional theological frameworks, ultimately undermined those frameworks. This was the paradox of medieval intellectual life. The very institutions and events that were meant to strengthen medieval beliefs often ended up transforming them. The medieval worldview was not destroyed by external enemies, but by its own internal contradictions, its own success, its own attempts to explain everything and solve every problem. The catalyst events of the medieval period did not just test medieval beliefs, they forged them. The Crusades created the concept of holy war. The Black Death intensified beliefs about sin and salvation. The Viking raids shaped ideas about divine protection and earthly vulnerability. The Translation movement forced the synthesis of reason and faith. The universities institutionalized the pursuit of knowledge within religious frameworks. These events created the conditions in which specific medieval beliefs could flourish. They provided the historical context that made certain ideas seem reasonable, necessary, and true. They created the pressures that forced medieval thinkers to develop new concepts, new theories, and new explanations for the world around them. By the 13th century, medieval civilization had achieved a synthesis of unprecedented scope and ambition. The worldview that emerged from centuries of theological debate, philosophical speculation, and practical experience was comprehensive, coherent, and confident. It provided answers to every question, explanations for every phenomenon, and solutions to every problem. It was a complete system of understanding that governed everything from royal policy to peasant practice. This was the moment when medieval beliefs reached their full flowering, when the accumulated wisdom of centuries crystallized into doctrines that would define European thought for generations. These beliefs were not simple superstitions but sophisticated theories developed by some of the most brilliant minds in human history. They were wrong about almost everything, but they were magnificently, systematically, and confidently wrong. A medical and bodily beliefs medieval medicine was based on a theory so elegant, so comprehensive, and so logical that it dominated European medical practice for over 1,000 years. The theory of the four humors, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen and refined by Islamic medical scholars, provided a complete explanation for human health, disease, personality, and behavior. According to this theory, the human body contained four basic fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors corresponded to the four classical elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and to the four basic qualities: hot, cold, moist, and dry. Blood was hot and moist like air. Phlegm was cold and moist like water. Yellow bile was hot and dry like fire. Black bile was cold and dry like earth. Health depended on maintaining the proper balance among these four humors. Disease resulted from humoral imbalance. Personality was determined by which humor predominated in an individual's constitution. A person with too much blood was sanguine optimistic, sociable, and prone to excess. A person with too much phlegm was phlegmatic calm, reliable, and slow to anger. A person with too much yellow bile was choleric ambitious, aggressive, and quick-tempered. A person with too much black bile was melancholic thoughtful, artistic, and prone to depression. This theory was not just a medical hypothesis but a complete anthropology. It explained why people were different, why they got sick, and how they should live. It provided a scientific basis for social hierarchy. Nobles were naturally sanguine, while peasants were naturally phlegmatic. It offered a rational approach to treatment. Diseases caused by excess heat required cooling remedies, while diseases caused by excess moisture required drying treatments. The practical applications of humoral theory shaped every aspect of medieval medical practice. Bloodletting was the most common treatment because it directly addressed humoral imbalance by removing excess blood. Physicians would carefully calculate how much blood to remove based on the patient's age, constitution, the season of the year, and the phase of the moon. They developed elaborate charts showing which veins should be opened for which conditions. The practice of bloodletting was so central to medieval medicine that it was performed not just by physicians but by barbers who advertised their services with the red and white striped poles that can still be seen outside barbershops today. The red stripe represented arterial blood, The white stripe represented bandages, and the blue stripe, added later, represented venous blood. Medieval physicians also practiced trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure, release evil humors, or allow demons to escape. Archaeological evidence shows that many patients survived this procedure, suggesting that medieval surgeons were more skilled than is often assumed. The fact that they attempted such operations at all reveals both their courage and their confidence. In their theoretical understanding of disease, the doctrine of signatures was another fundamental principle of medieval medicine. This theory held that God had marked every plant and mineral with signs indicating its medical uses. Plants that resembled human organs could be used to treat diseases of those organs. The heart-shaped leaves of the lime tree indicated its usefulness. In treating heart disease, the brain-shaped walnut was obviously intended to cure headaches. The yellow sap of celandine showed that it could treat jaundice. This doctrine was not just a practical guide to herbal medicine, but a theological statement about the nature of creation. God had not just created the world, but had designed it as a pharmacy for human use. Every illness had its cure, and every cure was clearly marked by divine providence. The physician's job was not to discover new treatments, but to read the signs that God had already provided. Medieval theories of reproduction were equally systematic and equally wrong. Physicians believed that both men and women contributed seed to conception, but that the male seed was active and formative, while the female seed was passive and material. The sex of the child was determined by which seed was stronger and by the position of the planets at the moment of conception. Pregnancy was thought to last anywhere from 7 to 10 months, with 7-month and 9-month babies being most likely to survive. The development of the fetus was governed by the same humoral principles that governed all life. The mother's diet, emotions, and activities could all affect the child's development. Pregnant women were advised to avoid strong emotions, ugly sights, and violent movements lest they harm the child. Medieval physicians had elaborate theories about the relationship between physical and mental health. They believed that strong emotions could cause physical illness and that physical illness could cause mental disturbance. The heart was thought to be the seat of emotion, the liver the source of courage, and the spleen the origin of melancholy. The brain was important but was seen primarily as a cooling system for the blood rather than as the center of thought and personality. The medieval understanding of anatomy was based largely on the works of Galen, who had dissected animals but not humans. As a result, medieval physicians believed that the heart had 3 chambers instead of 4, that the liver had 5 lobes instead of 2, and that blood was produced in the liver rather than circulated by the heart. These errors persisted for centuries because human dissection was rare and was conducted primarily to confirm existing theories rather than to discover new facts. Medieval surgery was far more advanced than is often realized. Medieval surgeons performed cataract operations, set broken bones, and even attempted brain surgery. They developed sophisticated techniques for treating wounds, infections, and traumatic injuries. Military surgeons gained extensive experience treating battle injuries and developed innovative approaches to amputation, bone setting, and wound care. But medieval surgery was limited by the lack of effective anesthesia and antisepsis. Surgeons used alcohol, opium, and herbal preparations to dull pain, but these were only partially effective. The risk of infection was enormous, and many patients died not from their original injuries but from post-operative complications. As a result, surgery was a last resort, attempted only when all other treatments had failed. Medieval medicine was also deeply influenced by astrology. Physicians believed that the positions of the planets and stars affected human health, and that successful treatment required careful attention to celestial influences. Each organ was ruled by a different planet, and each disease had its own astrological signature. Surgery could only be performed when the relevant planets were in favorable positions. Medical. Astrology was not a fringe practice but an essential part of medical education. Medical students learned to cast horoscopes as carefully as they learned anatomy. They memorized the astrological associations of different diseases and treatments. They calculated the best times for bloodletting, surgery, and the administration of medicines based on the positions of the heavenly bodies. The integration of medicine and astrology was part of a larger medieval belief in the interconnectedness of all things. The human body was a microcosm of the universe, subject to the same forces and governed by the same principles as the stars and planets. Health required harmony not just within the body, but between the body and the cosmos. This holistic approach to medicine had both strengths and weaknesses. On the positive side, medieval physicians paid attention to the whole person diet, lifestyle, emotions, and environment, rather than just treating symptoms. They recognized the importance of prevention, as well as cure. They understood that physical and mental health were interconnected. On the negative side, medieval medicine was often more concerned with theoretical consistency than with practical results. When treatments failed, physicians were more likely to blame improper application of correct principles than to question the principles themselves. When new observations contradicted established theories, the observations were often dismissed as anomalous rather than used to revise the theories. B. Cosmological and natural world beliefs. The medieval understanding of the cosmos was a masterpiece of philosophical architecture. Drawing on Aristotelian physics, Ptolemaic astronomy, and Christian theology, medieval thinkers created a model of the universe that was not only scientifically sophisticated, but also morally meaningful and aesthetically beautiful. Contrary to popular belief, medieval scholars did not think the earth was flat. They knew it was spherical and had calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy. The myth of medieval flat earth belief was largely created by 19th century writers who wanted to contrast medieval ignorance with modern enlightenment. In reality, every educated person in medieval Europe knew the earth was round. What medieval thinkers did believe was that the earth was the center of the universe. According to the geocentric model developed by Ptolemy and refined by Islamic astronomers, the earth sat motionless at the center of a series of concentric crystalline spheres. Each sphere carried one of the celestial bodies: the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Beyond these planetary spheres was the sphere of fixed stars, and beyond that was the Empyrean, the dwelling place of God and the angels. This model was not just a description of physical structure, but a moral geography. The farther from Earth, the more perfect and divine. The Earth, at the center, was the realm of corruption, change, and sin. The celestial spheres were the realm of perfection, immutability, and divine order. The hierarchy of the heavens reflected the hierarchy of creation itself. The crystalline spheres were thought to be composed of a fifth element called quintessence or ether, which was perfect, transparent, and incorruptible. Unlike the four terrestrial elements earth, water, air, and fire, which were subject to change and decay, the quintessence was eternal and unchanging. This explained why the celestial bodies moved in perfect circles with constant velocity, while terrestrial objects moved in imperfect lines and were subject to acceleration and deceleration. Medieval astronomers made careful observations of planetary motions and developed increasingly sophisticated mathematical models to account for their apparent irregularities. They knew that planets sometimes appeared to move backward against the background of fixed stars and developed the theory of epicycles to explain this retrograde motion. According to this theory, planets moved in small circles called epicycles. which in turn moved along larger circles called deferents. The complexity of these models did not trouble medieval astronomers because they served two different purposes. As mathematical tools for predicting planetary positions, they were judged by their accuracy. As philosophical descriptions of physical reality, they were judged by their consistency with Aristotelian principles. Medieval thinkers had no difficulty maintaining that the mathematical models were useful fictions while the physical reality was Aristotelian spheres. Medieval astrology was based on the belief that celestial bodies influence terrestrial events through the radiation of occult forces. This was not considered superstition but natural philosophy. Just as the sun obviously influenced the seasons and the moon obviously influenced the tides, other celestial bodies were thought to influence other aspects of earthly life. Each planet was associated with particular qualities, occupations, and types of people. Saturn was cold and dry, associated with melancholy, agriculture, and old age. Jupiter was hot and moist, associated with good fortune, religion, and nobility. Mars was hot and dry, associated with war, violence, and soldiers. The Sun was hot and dry, associated with authority, health, and kings. Venus was hot and moist, associated with love, beauty, and artists. Mercury was variable, associated with communication, trade, and scholars. The Moon was cold and moist, associated with change, travel, and common people. The influence of the stars was thought to be mediated through the four elements and the four humors. Planetary rays heated or cooled, dried or moistened the air, which in turn affected the balance of humors in human bodies. This provided a causal mechanism for astrological influence that was consistent with medieval physics and medicine. Medieval astrology distinguished between natural astrology, which dealt with weather, agriculture, and medicine, and judicial astrology, which attempted to predict specific events and individual fates. Natural astrology was generally accepted by the Church because it was based on observable natural phenomena. Judicial astrology was more controversial because it seemed to deny human free will and divine providence. The debate over astrology revealed fundamental tensions in medieval thought about the relationship between natural causation and divine intervention, between cosmic determinism and moral responsibility, between scientific explanation and religious faith. These tensions were never fully resolved and would continue to trouble medieval thinkers throughout the period. Medieval alchemy was another attempt to understand and manipulate the natural world through a combination of observation, experiment, and theory. Alchemists believed that all metals were composed of varying proportions of sulfur and mercury, and that by manipulating these proportions, it was possible to transmute base metals into gold. This theory was not just about making money, but about understanding the fundamental nature of matter. Alchemists believed that all substances were expressions of underlying principles, and that by mastering these principles, it was possible to achieve mastery over nature itself. The Philosopher's Stone, which could supposedly transmute metals and cure all diseases, was the ultimate goal of alchemical research. Alchemy was closely connected to medicine because alchemists developed many of the techniques and substances used by medieval physicians. They invented distillation, sublimation, and other chemical processes. They prepared mineral medicines, metallic preparations, and chemical compounds. Many alchemists were also physicians who used their knowledge of chemical processes to create new treatments for disease. But alchemy was also a spiritual discipline that aimed at the transmutation not just of metals, but of the alchemist himself. The process of creating the Philosopher's Stone was understood as a parallel to the process of achieving spiritual perfection. The alchemical laboratory was a temple. The alchemical process was a form of prayer, and the successful alchemist was a kind of priest. Medieval bestiaries were encyclopedias of real and imaginary animals that provided moral instruction through natural history. Each animal was described not just in terms of its physical characteristics, but in terms of its moral significance. The lion was the king of beasts because of its courage and nobility. The lamb was a symbol of innocence and sacrifice. The serpent was a symbol of evil and deception. Many of the animals described in medieval bestiaries were purely imaginary unicorns, griffins, phoenixes, and dragons. But these creatures were not understood as fictional, but as rare species that lived in distant lands. The unicorn, which could only be captured by a virgin, was a symbol of Christ. The phoenix, which died and was reborn from its own ashes, was a symbol of resurrection. The dragon was a symbol of Satan and evil. Even real animals were often described in ways that seem fantastic to modern readers. Medieval bestiaries claimed that elephants had no knee joints and had to sleep leaning against trees, that pelicans fed their young with blood from their own breasts, and that beavers castrated themselves when pursued by hunters. These descriptions were not based on careful observation, but on literary tradition and moral symbolism. The medieval understanding of weather was based on the belief that atmospheric phenomena were caused by the interaction of celestial influences with terrestrial elements. Rain was caused by the sun drawing moisture from the earth into the air, where it was condensed by cold planetary influences. Wind was caused by the heating and cooling of air by different celestial bodies. Thunder was caused by the collision of hot and cold vapors in the upper atmosphere. Medieval people also believed that weather could be controlled through magical means. Learned magicians could allegedly summon storms, dispel clouds, and change the direction of the wind through ritual invocations and the use of appropriate talismans. This was not considered supernatural but natural, the application of hidden knowledge about the occult properties of natural objects. The belief in weather magic was closely connected to the belief in demonic influence. Devils were thought to have power over the elements and to be able to cause storms, floods, and droughts through the manipulation of natural forces. Witches were believed to have made pacts with devils that gave them similar powers. The church developed elaborate rituals for blessing crops, exorcising storms, and protecting communities from supernatural weather. Manipulation. Medieval theories about the formation of the earth and its geological features were based on the biblical account of creation combined with Aristotelian natural philosophy. The earth was thought to have been created in its present form by divine command, but its surface features were shaped by natural processes operating according to divine law. Mountains were thought to be caused by earthquakes, which were in turn caused by winds trapped in underground caverns. Rivers were thought to originate from underground seas that were connected to the ocean through subterranean passages. Springs were thought to be places where these underground waters reached the surface. Medieval people had various theories about the existence of Antipodeans, people who lived on the opposite side of the earth. Some argued that such people could not exist because they would fall off the earth. Others argued that they could not exist because they would be cut off from divine revelation. Still others argued that they did exist but were not descendants of Adam and therefore not subject to original sin. The debate over Antipodeans was not just about geography but about theology. If people existed on the other side of the world, how had they heard the gospel? If they had not heard the gospel, could they be saved? If they could be saved without hearing the gospel, what was the point of missionary activity? These questions would become urgent when Europeans actually encountered the peoples of the Americac social and legal beliefs. Medieval society was organized around the principle that social hierarchy was not just convenient or traditional, but divinely ordained. The three orders theory, which emerged in the 11th century, held that society was divided into three functional groups: those who prayed, oratores; those who fought, bellatores; and those who worked, labratores. Each order had its own duties, privileges, and relationship to God. The clergy, as those who prayed, were responsible for the spiritual welfare of society. They interceded with God on behalf of the laity, administered the sacraments, and provided moral guidance. Their authority came directly from God through apostolic succession. They were exempt from secular law, taxation, and military service because their primary loyalty was to the heavenly kingdom rather than to earthly rulers. The nobility, as those who fought, were responsible for the physical protection of society. They defended the church, protected the weak, and maintained order through the exercise of legitimate violence. Their authority came from God through the king, who ruled by divine right. They held land in exchange for military service and were bound by the code of chivalry to use their power responsibly. The peasantry, as those who worked, were responsible for the material support of society. They produced the food, clothing, and other necessities that allowed the clergy to pray and the nobility to fight. Their status was humble but necessary. They were bound to the land by divine decree and owed labor service to their lords in exchange for protection and the right to farm. This theory provided a theological justification for social inequality that was complete and compelling. Each person had a divinely appointed role to play in the cosmic drama of salvation. Social mobility was not just difficult but sinful. It represented a rebellion against God's will. The poor were poor because God had assigned them that role, and the rich were rich because God had chosen them for positions of responsibility and trust. The theory of divine right monarchy held that kings ruled not by human consent but by divine appointment. Kings were God's viceroys on earth, appointed to maintain order and dispense justice according to divine law. They were accountable not to their subjects but to God, who had given them their authority and who would judge their use of it. This theory had profound implications for political theory and practice. Rebellion against a legitimate king was not just treason but sacrilege. Kings could not be deposed by human authority because human authority could not override divine appointment. The only check on royal power was the king's own conscience and his fear of divine judgment. But divine right also imposed obligations on kings. They were expected to rule justly, protect the church, defend the weak, and promote the common good. Kings who abused their power were thought to be acting contrary to God's will and could expect divine punishment. The theory of divine right was thus both a source of royal authority and a constraint on royal behavior. Medieval legal systems were based on the principle that law was not created by human legislators but discovered by human judges. Law was thought to be eternal and unchanging, rooted in divine will and natural reason. The judge's job was not to make law but to find it, not to innovate but to apply traditional principles to new situations. This understanding of law led to the development of complex procedures for determining what the law actually required in particular cases. Trial by ordeal was one such procedure, based on the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The accused might be required to walk on hot coals, plunge their hand into boiling water, or carry a red-hot iron. If they were unharmed, they were innocent. If they were injured, they were guilty. Trial by combat was another procedure based on the belief that God would give victory to the righteous cause. The accused and the accuser, or their champions, would fight, and the winner would be declared to have had God on his side. This procedure was particularly common in cases involving questions of honor, property rights, and feudal obligations. These procedures seem irrational to modern minds, but they were logical within the medieval worldview. If God was just and omnipotent, He would not allow the innocent to suffer or the guilty to escape. If divine intervention was possible, it was reasonable to create procedures that would allow God to reveal His will directly. The fact that these procedures sometimes produced unjust results was explained as evidence of divine inscrutability rather than as proof of their invalidity. Medieval concepts of honor and shame were central to social organization and individual identity. Honor was not just personal reputation, but a form of social capital that could be accumulated, lost, and inherited. A person without honor was effectively outside society, unable to make contracts, give testimony, or participate in social life. Honor was closely connected to social status, but it was not identical to it. A peasant could have honor within his own social sphere, while a nobleman could lose honor through dishonorable behavior. Honor required not just high birth, but appropriate conduct. It had to be constantly maintained through proper behavior and defended against challenges and insults. The code of chivalry that governed noble behavior was an elaborate system of honor-based ethics that combined Christian morality with warrior values. Knights were expected to be brave in battle, generous to their inferiors, loyal to their superiors, and protective of women and children. They were supposed to fight fairly, keep their word, and defend the church against its enemies. But chivalry was also about social display and competitive consumption. Knights were expected to dress magnificently, feast lavishly, and give generous gifts. They were supposed to be skilled in hunting, hawking, and courtly entertainment. They were expected to be patrons of art, literature, and music. Chivalry was thus both a moral code and a lifestyle that reinforced social hierarchy through cultural distinction. Medieval concepts of gender were based on the belief that men and women were fundamentally different in nature, capacity, and destiny. Women were thought to be physically weaker, intellectually inferior, and morally more prone to temptation than Faustin men. Men. These differences were not just cultural but biological and spiritual, rooted in the very nature of creation. The story of Adam and Eve provided the theological foundation for medieval gender theory. Eve had been created from Adam's rib as his helper and companion. Her temptation by the serpent and subsequent temptation of Adam had brought sin and death into the world. Women were thus responsible for humanity's fall from grace, and were naturally more susceptible to demonic influence, but women also had a special role in the plan of salvation through the figure of the Virgin Mary. Mary's acceptance of the Annunciation had made possible the incarnation and redemption. Her perpetual virginity and sinless nature made her the opposite of Eve, where Eve had brought death. Mary had brought life. This provided a model of female perfection that was both inspiring and impossible to achieve. Medieval marriage was understood not as a romantic partnership, but as a social and economic arrangement designed to produce legitimate heirs and maintain family property. Love was considered dangerous because it could lead to irrational choices that disrupted social order. Marriages were typically arranged by parents or guardians who considered compatibility of status, wealth, and family interests rather than personal affection. The Church's teaching on marriage was complex and sometimes contradictory. Marriage was considered a sacrament, blessed by God and indissoluble except by death. But celibacy was considered a higher calling, and sexual desire was inherently sinful even within marriage. The ideal marriage was one in which the partners lived together chastely, using their sexual relationship only for procreation and then with regret and penance. Medieval theories of childhood were based on the belief that children were not just small adults, but fundamentally different kinds of beings. Children were born in sin and remained in a state of spiritual and moral incompleteness until they reached the age of reason. typically thought to be around 7 years old. Before this age, they were not capable of moral choice and were not responsible for their actions. This understanding of childhood had important implications for education, discipline, and social organization. Children required constant supervision and correction to prevent them from following their naturally sinful inclinations. Education was primarily moral rather than intellectual. Its goal was to shape character rather than to impart knowledge. Physical punishment was considered necessary and beneficial because it taught children to control their base impulses. Supernatural and religious beliefs. The tildekiefs the viefs the vatev to control their base impulses. Medieval understanding of the supernatural was not separate from the natural world, but intimately connected to it. The boundary between natural and supernatural was fluid and permeable. Angels and demons were as real as animals and plants. Miracles were as natural as rainfall. The spiritual world was not distant and abstract, but immediate and concrete. The doctrine of transubstantiation, defined at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, held that during the celebration of the Mass, the bread and wine were literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ. This was not symbolic or metaphorical, but actual and physical. The accidents, the appearance, taste, and texture remained the same, but the substance was completely changed. This doctrine required a sophisticated philosophical framework that distinguished between substance and accidents, between essence and appearance. It drew on Aristotelian metaphysics to explain how something could be completely transformed while appearing unchanged. It was a triumph of theological reasoning that satisfied both the demands of faith and the requirements of logic. But transubstantiation also had profound implications for medieval religious practice. If the consecrated host was literally the body of Christ, it deserved the same worship that was due to Christ himself. The elevation of the host during Mass became a moment of intense devotion. The reserved sacrament became an object of continuous adoration. Processions of the Blessed Sacrament became major public celebrations. The belief in transubstantiation also created new anxieties and responsibilities. What happened if the host was dropped or damaged? What if it was stolen or desecrated? What if it was received by someone in a state of mortal sin? These questions required elaborate rules and procedures that governed every aspect of sacramental practice. Medieval beliefs about relics were based on the conviction that the bodies of saints retained miraculous power after death. The bones, hair, clothing, and personal possessions of holy men and women could cure disease, protect against danger, and work wonders for those who approach them with faith. Relics were not just memorials but active agents of divine power. The cult of relics led to a massive trade in holy objects that connected Europe to the furthest reaches of the Christian world. Pilgrims traveled thousands of miles to venerate the relics of particular saints. Churches competed to acquire the most powerful relics and built elaborate shrines to house them. The possession of important relics could transform an obscure monastery into a major pilgrimage center with enormous wealth and influence. But the relic trade also created opportunities for fraud and abuse. Fake relics were common and the same. Saint might have multiple skulls or dozens of arm bones scattered across Europe. The Church developed procedures for authenticating relics, but these were often ineffective. The demand for relics was so great and the profit so enormous that the market was flooded with forgeries. Medieval beliefs about demonic possession were based on the conviction that devils could literally inhabit human bodies and control human behavior. Possession was not just mental illness but spiritual warfare, a literal battle between good and evil fought within the human soul. The symptoms of possession included superhuman strength, knowledge of hidden things, speaking in unknown languages, and violent aversion to sacred objects. Exorcism was the church's response to demonic possession. Trained priests used prayers, holy water, relics, and the sign of the cross to drive out demons and restore the possessed person to normal health. Exorcism was not just a ritual, but a form of spiritual combat that required great courage, faith, and skill. Not all priests were considered capable of performing exorcisms, and those who were often specialized in this ministry. The belief in possession and exorcism reveals the medieval understanding of the human person as a battleground between supernatural forces. Humans were not autonomous agents, but vessels that could be filled with either divine grace or demonic influence. Mental illness, epilepsy, and other neurological conditions were interpreted through this spiritual framework and treated with spiritual remedies. Medieval beliefs about saints and their intercession were based on the doctrine of the communion of saints, the idea that all Christians, living and dead, were united in a single spiritual community. The saints in heaven maintained their interest in earthly affairs and could intercede with God on behalf of those who invoked their aid. They were not just examples to be imitated, but advocates to be petitioned. Each saint had particular areas of expertise and could be invoked for specific needs. Saint Anthony of Padua helped find lost objects. Saint Barbara protected against lightning. Saint Sebastian protected against plague. Saint Christopher protected travelers. This specialization made the saints more accessible and relevant to ordinary people's daily concerns. The process of canonization was the Church's method for officially recognizing sanctity and authorizing public veneration. Candidates for sainthood had to demonstrate heroic virtue during their lifetime and perform miracles after their death. The investigation of alleged miracles required careful examination of witnesses, medical experts, and theological authorities. Only after this lengthy process could someone be declared a saint and added to the official calendar. But popular devotion often moved faster than official recognition. Local saints and folk saints were venerated by communities long before the Church approved their cults. This created tension between official and popular religion, between institutional control and grassroots devotion. The Church tried to regulate saint-making but could never completely control it. Medieval pilgrimage was based on the belief that certain places were especially holy and that visiting them could bring spiritual benefits, physical healing, and temporal blessings. Pilgrimage sites were typically associated with the life of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or important saints. They contained relics, miracle-working images, or other sacred objects that attracted pilgrims from great distances. The medieval world was built on a foundation of profound contradictions that created both its greatest achievements and its most tragic failures. These contradictions were not mere intellectual inconsistencies, but lived tensions that shaped every aspect of medieval life and thought out the gap between learned and popular beliefs. Perhaps the most fundamental contradiction lay in the vast gulf between the sophisticated theology of the learned elite and the practical religion of ordinary people. While university-trained clerics debated the fine points of transubstantiation using Aristotelian metaphysics, peasants in remote villages continued to practice forms of Christianity that were barely distinguishable from ancient paganism. Learned tradition, centered in cathedral schools and universities, developed an increasingly complex and abstract understanding of Christian doctrine. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas created theological systems of breathtaking intellectual sophistication that attempted to reconcile faith with reason, revelation with philosophy, and Christian doctrine with Aristotelian science. These systems satisfied the minds of the educated, but remained largely incomprehensible to the masses. Popular religion, by contrast, was concrete, practical, and syncretic. It focused on immediate needs, protection from disease, good harvests, safe childbirth, and protection from evil forces. It incorporated elements from pre-Christian traditions that had never been fully eradicated. Holy wells, sacred trees, and protective charms coexisted with Christian prayers and sacraments. Saints took on the attributes of pagan gods, and Christian festivals were celebrated at the same times and places as ancient pagan celebrations. This gap created ongoing tensions within the church itself. Reforming bishops and abbots constantly struggled to eliminate what they saw as superstitious practices and educate the clergy in proper doctrine. But these efforts met with limited success because popular religion served real psychological and social needs that abstract theology could not address. The contradiction was particularly acute in rural areas, where the priest might be only marginally more educated than his parishioners. Many priests could barely read Latin and understood little of the theology they were supposed to teach. They often participated in or tolerated practices that horrified visiting bishops and learned clerics. How? Beliefs justified social hierarchies. Medieval religious beliefs provided a powerful, ideological framework that justified and reinforced the rigid social hierarchies of feudal society. The doctrine of the three orders, those who fought bellatores, those who prayed oratores, and those who worked labratores, was presented as a divinely ordained arrangement that reflected the natural order of creation. This hierarchical vision was reinforced by the concept of the great chain of being, which arranged all of creation in a vertical hierarchy from God at the top through angels, humans, animals, plants, and minerals at the bottom. Within human society, kings ruled. By divine right, nobles were born to their status, and peasants were bound to the soil by God's will. Social mobility was not just difficult, but potentially sinful. An attempt to violate the order that God had established. The cult of chivalry provided an elaborate ideological justification for noble violence. Knights were not mere warriors, but Christian soldiers whose violence was sanctified by their defense of the church and protection of the weak. The brutal realities of feudal warfare, the burning of villages, the slaughter of peasants, the rape and pillage that accompanied medieval campaigns were transformed through chivalric ideology into acts of Christian virtue. Religious beliefs about women provided justification for their systematic exclusion from political power and intellectual life. The story of Eve's temptation was used to argue that women were inherently weak-willed and susceptible to sin. The cult of the Virgin Mary, while elevating the feminine principle in some ways, also reinforced impossible standards of purity that real women could never achieve. Women could be saints or sinners, virgins or whores, but they could not be full participants in public life. The doctrine of original sin was used to justify the suffering of the poor and powerless. Poverty, disease, and social oppression were presented as consequences of humanity's fallen state, rather than as injustices that could and should be remedied. The promise of heavenly reward was used to discourage earthly rebellion and encourage acceptance of temporal suffering. The human cost of medical ignorance, the medical beliefs of the medieval period, while logical within their theoretical framework, exacted a terrible human cost. The theory of the four humors led to treatments that were often more harmful than the diseases they were meant to cure. Bloodletting, the most common medieval medical intervention, weakened patients who needed strength to fight illness. Purging and vomiting emptied bodies that needed nourishment. Hot irons and caustic substances burned flesh that needed healing. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, leading to shock, infection, and death. Drilling holes in the skull to release evil humors was performed on patients suffering from headaches, epilepsy, and mental illness. Many patients died from the procedure itself, while others suffered permanent brain damage. Obstetric practices were particularly dangerous. The belief that difficult labor was punishment for sin led to treatments that increased rather than decreased maternal mortality. Midwives were forbidden to use pain relief during childbirth because labor pains were considered part of Eve's curse. Caesarean sections were only performed after the mother had died, making it impossible to save both mother and child. The doctrine of signatures led physicians to prescribe treatments based on superficial resemblances rather than therapeutic effectiveness. Yellow flowers were used to treat jaundice, red substances for blood diseases, and plants with heart-shaped leaves for cardiac conditions. These treatments were not just ineffective but often toxic, as many of the prescribed substances were poisonous. The rejection of dissection and anatomical study meant that medieval physicians had little accurate knowledge of human anatomy and physiology. They relied on ancient texts by Galen and Avicenna that were based on animal dissections and contained numerous errors. These errors were perpetuated for centuries because direct observation was discouraged or forbidden. The belief in supernatural causes of disease led to treatments that ignored natural remedies and practical interventions. Prayer, exorcism, and pilgrimage were prescribed for conditions that could have been treated with proper nutrition, hygiene, and medical care. The result was unnecessary suffering and death on a massive scale. Religious persecution based on doctrinal differences. The medieval emphasis on doctrinal orthodoxy led to systematic persecution of those whose beliefs differed from official church teaching. Heretics, Jews, Muslims, and pagans were subjected to violence, exile, and death in the name of preserving Christian truth and protecting society from spiritual contamination. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, developed sophisticated techniques for identifying, prosecuting, and punishing heretics. Suspects were interrogated under torture, encouraged to confess their errors, and required to name accomplices. Those who recanted were subjected to public penance and lifelong surveillance. Those who refused to recant were handed over to secular authorities for execution. The persecution of Jews was justified by theological arguments that portrayed them as enemies of Christ and threats to Christian society. They were accused of ritual murder, host desecration, and conspiracy against Christianity. These accusations led to pogroms, expulsions, and mass murders that decimated Jewish communities across Europe. The Crusades combined religious fervor with military violence in ways that produced unprecedented levels of brutality. The massacre of Jerusalem's inhabitants in 1099, the sack of Constantinople in 1204, and the systematic extermination of the Cathars in southern France were all justified as acts of religious devotion. The promise of indulgences for crusading transformed murder and pillage into meritorious acts that earned heavenly reward. The persecution of women accused of witchcraft reached its peak in the later medieval period, but had roots in earlier beliefs about female weakness and diabolic influence. Women who practiced traditional healing, displayed unusual knowledge, or simply aroused suspicion could be accused of making pacts with the devil. The procedures for trying witches assumed guilt and made acquittal virtually impossible. The suppression versus preservation of knowledge. Medieval religious institutions played a contradictory role in the preservation and transmission of knowledge. On one hand, monasteries and cathedral schools were the primary centers of learning in medieval Europe. They preserved classical texts, maintained libraries, and provided education for both clergy and lay people. Without these institutions, much of the intellectual heritage of antiquity would have been lost forever. Monks and clerics copied manuscripts, translated texts from Greek and Arabic, and created new works of theology, philosophy, and science. They established schools that evolved into the first universities. They developed new techniques in agriculture, architecture, and engineering. They supported artists, musicians, and writers who created some of the greatest works of medieval culture. Yet these same institutions also suppressed knowledge that was deemed dangerous or heretical. Classical works that contradicted Christian doctrine were censored or destroyed. Scientific theories that challenged biblical cosmology were condemned. Philosophical systems that emphasized reason over faith were banned from university curricula. Index of prohibited books, while formally established later, had medieval precedents in the Church's efforts to control what people could read and think. Works by Aristotle were temporarily banned from the University of Paris. The writings of Averroes and Avicenna were subjected to censorship. Even Christian authors like Peter Abelard faced persecution for their theological innovations. The suppression of knowledge was not just institutional but social. Popular suspicion of learning meant that scholars and intellectuals faced accusations of pride, curiosity, and trafficking with demons. The stereotype of the learned magician reflected popular anxieties about the dangers of excessive learning and intellectual ambition. The result was a culture that simultaneously venerated and feared knowledge, that preserved texts while restricting access to them, and that produced great scholars while persecuting intellectual innovation. This contradiction would eventually contribute to the breakdown of medieval synthesis and the emergence of new forms of learning in the Renaissance. The medieval worldview did not collapse suddenly, but underwent a gradual transformation that stretched across several centuries. The process began with internal contradictions and external challenges that emerged in the High Middle Ages and culminated in the intellectual revolutions of the Renaissance and early modern period. The Renaissance. Challenge to medieval thought, the Renaissance represented not just a revival of classical learning, but a fundamental challenge to medieval ways of thinking about the world and humanity's place within it. Renaissance humanists rejected the medieval emphasis on otherworldly concerns and instead celebrated human dignity, achievement, and potential. The humanist movement, beginning with figures like Petrarch and Boccaccio in 14th century Italy, rediscovered classical texts that offered alternatives to medieval Christian philosophy. They found in Cicero, Plato, and other ancient authors a vision of human excellence that did not depend on divine grace or ecclesiastical authority. They celebrated the individual rather than the community, this world rather than the next, and human reason rather than revealed truth. Renaissance artists broke with medieval conventions by developing new techniques of perspective, anatomy, and representation that emphasized the natural world rather than spiritual symbolism. Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical studies violated church prohibitions against dissection. Michelangelo's David celebrated the human form in ways that would have scandalized medieval sensibilities. Renaissance painting moved from flat, symbolic representations to three-dimensional, naturalistic depictions that focused on human emotion and experience. The development of Renaissance political thought challenged medieval assumptions about divine authority and social hierarchy. Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince analyzed political power in purely secular terms, ignoring traditional Christian constraints on rulers. Other political theorists began to explore concepts of popular sovereignty, natural rights, and constitutional government that undermined feudal and ecclesiastical authority. Renaissance scholars also began to apply critical methods to religious texts and traditions. Lorenzo Valla's proof that the donation of Constantine was a forgery undermined papal claims to temporal authority. Humanist biblical scholars like Erasmus applied philological techniques to the New Testament that revealed errors in the Vulgate translation. These scholarly innovations raised questions about church authority and textual reliability that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation. The printing press and knowledge democratization, the invention of movable type printing by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450 revolutionized the production and distribution of knowledge in ways that fundamentally undermined medieval systems of intellectual control. Before printing, books were rare, expensive, and largely confined to religious institutions and wealthy elites. After printing, books became relatively cheap and widely available, making it impossible for authorities to maintain their monopoly on learning. The printing press had several revolutionary effects on medieval thought and society. First, it standardized texts and made exact reproduction possible for the first time. Medieval manuscripts were full of copying errors that accumulated over generations. Printed books eliminated these errors and allowed for precise citation and reference. This standardization was crucial for the development of modern scholarship and science. Second, printing made vernacular literature economically viable for the first time. Medieval books were primarily written in Latin and aimed at educated clerical audiences. Printed books could be produced in local languages for popular markets. This democratization of literature undermined the Church's monopoly on education and created new forms of cultural expression that bypassed clerical control. Third, printing accelerated the spread of new ideas and made it impossible for authorities to suppress them effectively. A medieval heretic like Peter Waldo could only reach a limited audience through personal preaching and handwritten texts. A Renaissance reformer like Martin Luther could reach thousands of readers through printed pamphlets that were quickly reprinted and distributed across Europe. The printing press also facilitated the development of modern science by making it possible to share experimental results, theoretical innovations, and technical knowledge across vast distances. Scientific treatises could be illustrated with precise diagrams and distributed to communities of scholars who could verify, criticize, and build upon each other's work. This collaborative approach to knowledge was fundamentally different from the medieval emphasis on authority and tradition. The economic effects of printing were equally revolutionary. The book trade created new forms of commercial enterprise and intellectual property. Publishers invested in secular works that had market appeal rather than just religious texts that served institutional needs. This commercial logic gradually shifted intellectual production away from religious to secular concerns. Scientific revolution beginnings. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries represented the final collapse of medieval natural philosophy and its replacement with modern scientific method. This transformation began with astronomy and mathematics, but eventually encompassed all areas of natural knowledge. The Copernican Revolution, initiated by Nicolaus Copernicus on the revolutions of the celestial spheres, 1543, challenged the geocentric cosmology that had been central to medieval thought for over a millennium. Copernicus's heliocentric model was initially rejected by most scholars because it contradicted both Aristotelian physics and biblical passages that seemed to describe a stationary Earth, but subsequent observations by Galileo, Galilei, and theoretical work by Johannes Kepler provided overwhelming evidence for the heliocentric model. The telescope, invented in the early 17th century, revealed celestial phenomena that medieval cosmology could not explain. Galileo's observations of the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the rough surface of the moon contradicted Aristotelian claims about the perfection and unchangeability of the heavens. These discoveries required a complete reconceptualization of the universe and humanity's place within it. The development of experimental method by figures like Francis Bacon and Galileo Galilei represented a fundamental break with medieval approaches to natural knowledge. Medieval natural philosophers relied primarily on textual authority and logical deduction. Modern scientists emphasize direct observation, controlled experimentation, and mathematical analysis. This methodological revolution made possible rapid advances in physics, chemistry, biology, and other fields. The mechanical philosophy developed by René Descartes, Pierre Gassendi, and others replaced medieval organic cosmology with a vision of the universe as a vast machine operating according to mathematical laws. This mechanistic worldview eliminated the need for supernatural intervention in natural processes and reduced the role of divine providence to initial creation and law-giving. The scientific revolution also transformed medicine and biology. Andreas Vesalius's detailed anatomical studies, based on direct dissection of human bodies, corrected centuries of errors inherited from ancient authorities. William Harvey's discovery of blood circulation overthrew medieval theories about the humors and pneuma. These medical advances saved countless lives and demonstrated the practical benefits of experimental science over traditional authority. Protestant Reformation's impact on authority. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, shattered the religious unity that had been central to medieval civilization. The Reformation challenged not just specific church practices, but the entire system of ecclesiastical authority that had governed medieval intellectual and spiritual life. Luther's doctrine of sola scriptura, Scripture alone, rejected the medieval synthesis of biblical revelation with church tradition and papal authority. Protestant reformers argued that individuals could read and interpret the Bible for themselves without need for clerical mediation. This principle of private judgment undermined the entire medieval system of religious authority and opened the door to endless sectarian divisions. The translation of the Bible into vernacular languages made it accessible to ordinary people for the first time. Translations by Luther, Tyndale, and others allowed lay people to read Scripture directly rather than depending on clerical interpretation. This democratization of religious knowledge paralleled the broader democratization of learning made possible by printing. Protestant emphasis on justification by faith alone challenged medieval practices like pilgrimage, relic veneration, and indulgences that had been central to popular religion. Reformers argued that these practices were not only useless but actually harmful to salvation because they encouraged reliance on works rather than faith. This theological revolution transformed religious practice and eliminated many of the pundina beliefs and customs that had defined medieval Christianity. The Reformation also had profound political consequences that accelerated the breakdown of medieval social structures. Protestant princes used religious reform to justify resistance to the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. The Peace of Augsburg, 1555, and later the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, recognized the principle that rulers could determine the religion of their territories. This legitimation of religious diversity undermined the medieval ideal of a unified Christian commonwealth. The wars of religion that followed the Reformation demonstrated the destructive potential of religious conviction when combined with political ambition. The devastation of the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, discredited religious enthusiasm and encouraged the development of more secular approaches to politics and social organization. Discovery of the New World and expanded horizons. European discovery and colonization of the Americas, beginning with Columbus's voyage in 1492, expanded the intellectual horizons of medieval Europe in ways that fundamentally challenged existing assumptions about geography, anthropology, and divine providence. The existence of previously unknown continents populated by peoples who had never heard of Christianity raised profound theological questions that medieval thinkers were unprepared to answer. If God intended Christianity to be the universal religion, Why had he allowed millions of people to live and die in ignorance of the gospel? How could the Church claim universal authority when vast regions of the world had been completely outside its influence? The discovery of sophisticated civilizations in Mexico and Peru challenged European assumptions about the superiority of Christian culture. The Aztec and Inca empires had achieved levels of political organization, architecture, and engineering that rivaled or exceeded anything in medieval Europe. Their astronomical knowledge and mathematical skills impressed even their European conquerors. These discoveries forced Europeans to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between Christianity and civilization that the encounter with Native American religions and philosophies introduced Europeans to radically different ways of understanding the world and humanity's place within it. Native American concepts of time, nature, and social organization challenged European assumptions that were so fundamental they had rarely been questioned. The diversity of human beliefs and practices revealed by global exploration undermined claims about universal natural law and divine revelation. The economic consequences of American colonization transformed European society in ways that accelerated the breakdown of medieval social structures. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas caused inflation that undermined feudal relationships based on fixed rents and obligations. New forms of commercial capitalism emerged that were incompatible with traditional restrictions on usury and profit-making. The Atlantic slave trade, while morally horrific, created new forms of racial ideology that supplemented and eventually replaced medieval religious justifications for social hierarchy. The enslavement of Africans was justified not primarily by their paganism, which could be remedied through conversion, but by their alleged racial inferiority, which was considered permanent and inheritable. The transformation of medieval beliefs and worldviews did not end with the Renaissance and Reformation but continued to influence European intellectual development for centuries afterward. The relationship between medieval and modern thought has been complex, marked by both rejection and nostalgia, criticism and romantic revival. How Enlightenment thinkers created the Dark Ages myth. The term Dark Ages was not used by medieval people themselves but was invented by Renaissance humanists and popularized by Enlightenment thinkers who needed to contrast their own achievements with what they saw as the ignorance and superstition of the medieval period. This characterization was not merely descriptive, but served important ideological purposes in legitimating new forms of knowledge and authority. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, Edward Gibbon, and David Hume portrayed the medieval period as an age of religious fanaticism, intellectual stagnation, and social oppression from which Europe had fortunately escaped through the triumph of reason and science. They emphasized the persecution of heretics, the Crusades, and the Inquisition while ignoring medieval achievements in philosophy, technology, and social organization. This Dark Ages narrative served several functions for Enlightenment thinkers. First, it justified their rejection of traditional religious authority by portraying Christianity as inherently hostile to learning and progress. Second, it legitimated new forms of secular knowledge by contrasting them with medieval superstition. Third, it provided a teleological narrative of progress that culminated in their own age of reason and enlightenment. The Enlightenment critique of medieval thought was often unfair and anachronistic. Medieval thinkers were judged by standards that they did not share and criticized for failing to achieve goals that they had never set for themselves. The complexity and sophistication of medieval intellectual culture were ignored in favor of selective examples of ignorance and credulity. Enlightenment historians also projected their own secular concerns onto the medieval period, interpreting religious conflicts in terms of political power, struggles, and economic interests while ignoring the genuine theological issues that motivated medieval thinkers. This reductionist approach made it impossible to understand medieval beliefs on their own terms. The Dark Ages. Myth became so deeply embedded in European culture that it continued to influence historical scholarship well into the 20th century. Even historians who recognized medieval achievements often felt compelled to defend them against charges of obscurantism and backwardness. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to develop more balanced and sympathetic approaches to medieval thought and culture. Romantic revival of medieval ideals. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries represented a dramatic reversal of Enlightenment attitudes toward the medieval period. Romantic writers, artists, and thinkers found in medieval culture alternative to what they saw as the mechanistic, materialistic, and spiritually impoverished world of modern industrial society. Romantic authors like Sir Walter Scott, Victor Hugo, and the Brothers Grimm popularized medieval settings, characters, and themes that emphasized emotion over reason, faith over skepticism, and community over individualism. Gothic novels and Romantic poetry celebrated the mystery, passion, and spiritual intensity that Romantics associated with medieval life. The Gothic revival in architecture represented a conscious attempt to recreate medieval forms and values in the modern world. Neo-Gothic churches, universities, and government buildings were built across Europe and America as symbols of cultural continuity and spiritual aspiration. The rebuilding of the Palace of Westminster in Gothic style after the fire of 1834 represented a national commitment to medieval ideals of constitutionalism and tradition. Romantic philosophers like Friedrich Schleiermacher and Novalis found in medieval mysticism and spirituality resources for criticizing Enlightenment rationalism and developing new forms of religious experience. They emphasized the importance of feeling, intuition, and personal experience over doctrinal orthodoxy and institutional authority. The Romantic fascination with medieval culture was not merely antiquarian but served contemporary political and social purposes. Conservative thinkers used medieval ideals to criticize modern democracy, capitalism, and individualism. They portrayed medieval society as more organic, harmonious, and spiritually satisfying than modern industrial civilization. This Romantic idealization of the medieval period was often as distorted as the Enlightenment condemnation had been. Romantics emphasized the poetry, chivalry, and spirituality of medieval culture while ignoring its violence, inequality, and intellectual limitations. They created a fantasy medieval world that never existed, but that continued to influence popular perceptions of the Middle Ages. Modern historical reassessment. 20th century historical scholarship has developed more nuanced and balanced approaches to medieval beliefs and culture that avoid both Enlightenment condemnation and Romantic idealization. Modern historians have used new methods and sources to reconstruct medieval thought on its own terms rather than judging it by anachronistic standards. Social historians have shown that medieval beliefs were not simply imposed by clerical elites, but were actively shaped by popular participation and resistance. The relationship between learned and popular culture was more complex and interactive than earlier scholars had recognized. Medieval people were not passive recipients of clerical teaching, but active agents who adapted, modified, and sometimes rejected official doctrines. Intellectual historians have demonstrated the sophistication and complexity of medieval philosophical and theological thought. Figures like Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham were not mere compilers of ancient authorities, but original thinkers who made important contributions to philosophy, logic, and natural science. Medieval universities were centers of intellectual innovation that laid the foundations for modern scholarship. Religious historians have shown that medieval spirituality was far more diverse and dynamic than traditional accounts suggested. Mystical movements, popular devotions, and reform initiatives created forms of religious experience that were both deeply personal and socially transformative. Medieval Christianity was not a monolithic system, but a complex tradition that encompassed multiple theologies, practices, and institutions. Cultural historians have revealed the richness and creativity of medieval artistic and literary expression. Medieval art was not primitive or symbolic in crude ways, but represented sophisticated aesthetic theories and techniques. Medieval literature explored themes of love, adventure, and spiritual quest that continue to resonate with modern readers. Scientific historians have traced the continuities between medieval and modern natural philosophy, showing that the scientific revolution built upon rather than simply replaced medieval foundations. Medieval scholars made important contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and physics that prepared the way for later discoveries. The sharp contrast between medieval superstition and modern science has been replaced by a more gradualist understanding of intellectual development, persistence of medieval thinking patterns today. Despite the transformations of the past 5 centuries, many patterns of thought that characterized medieval culture continue to influence contemporary society in subtle but important ways. The human needs that medieval beliefs addressed, the search for meaning, the desire for community, the fear of chaos, remain constant across historical periods. Contemporary religious fundamentalism often exhibits the same characteristics that defined medieval orthodoxy: emphasis on textual authority, suspicion of secular knowledge, and concern with doctrinal purity. Modern religious movements frequently seek to recreate idealized versions of medieval Christian society, complete with traditional gender roles, hierarchical authority, and resistance to scientific theories that challenge biblical accounts. Conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific beliefs in contemporary society often follow patterns established in medieval thought. The tendency to explain complex phenomena through simple moral narratives, the preference for authority over evidence, and the suspicion of expert knowledge all have medieval precedents. Modern conspiracy theorists, like medieval people, tend to see hidden supernatural forces at work behind apparently natural events. The persistence of astrology, alternative medicine, and New Age spirituality in contemporary culture suggests that the human desire for magical thinking and supernatural explanation has not been eliminated by scientific education. These modern forms of magical thinking often explicitly reject scientific materialism in favor of holistic worldviews that resemble medieval cosmology. Political ideologies that emphasize national or ethnic identity often draw upon medieval models of community and belonging. The ideal of organic society, in which individuals find meaning through their role in a larger whole, continues to attract people who feel alienated by modern individualism and mobility. Fascist and nationalist movements have often used medieval symbolism and rhetoric to legitimate their claims to authority. The environmental movement has sometimes adopted quasi-medieval attitudes toward nature and technology, portraying the natural world as sacred and technology as destructive. This green romanticism echoes medieval suspicions of human ambition and pride while advocating for a more humble and harmonious relationship with the natural world. The lessons of medieval epistemology, the study of medieval beliefs, offers important lessons about the nature of knowledge, belief, and human understanding that remain relevant in the contemporary world. Medieval people were not less intelligent than modern people, but they operated within different epistemological frameworks that shaped what they could know and how they could know it. The medieval synthesis of faith and reason, while ultimately unsuccessful, represented a serious attempt to integrate different forms of human knowledge into a coherent worldview. The breakdown of this synthesis in the modern period has left us with fragmented forms of knowledge that often seem incompatible with each other. Science, religion, art, and politics operate in separate spheres with little communication or integration. Medieval. Respect for authority and tradition, while sometimes leading to intellectual stagnation, also provided stability and continuity that allowed for the gradual accumulation of knowledge over time. The modern emphasis on innovation and originality, while fostering rapid progress, has also led to the constant overthrow of established knowledge and the loss of hard-won insights from previous generations. The medieval understanding of knowledge as something that should serve moral and spiritual purposes, rather than merely satisfying curiosity or advancing human power, offers an alternative to modern instrumentalist approaches to learning. Medieval scholars saw knowledge as a form of worship and learning as a spiritual discipline. This integration of intellectual and moral development may be needed to address contemporary challenges that require both technical expertise and ethical wisdom. The medieval experience also demonstrates the dangers of intellectual certainty and the suppression of dissent. The persecution of heretics and the censorship of dangerous ideas, while motivated by genuine concern for social stability and spiritual welfare, ultimately impoverished medieval intellectual life and delayed important discoveries. Contemporary societies must balance the need for social cohesion with the requirement for intellectual freedom. Most importantly, the study of medieval beliefs reminds us that all human knowledge is historically conditioned and culturally constructed. What seems obviously true to one generation may appear absurd to the next. What appears to be objective scientific fact may contain hidden assumptions and biases that will be revealed by future scholarship. This recognition should inspire both intellectual humility and continued commitment to the pursuit of truth. The medieval beliefs that seem so strange and irrational to modern minds were neither crazy nor arbitrary, but represented logical responses to the human condition as medieval people understood it. They were attempts to make sense of a world that was mysterious, dangerous, and often incomprehensible, attempts that drew upon the best knowledge and wisdom available at the time, returned to the humanity of medieval belief. When we strip away the condescension and anachronism that have long characterized discussions of medieval thought, we discover that medieval people faced the same fundamental challenges that confront every human society. How do we understand the natural world? How do we organize social relationships? How do we cope with suffering and death? How do we find meaning and purpose in existence? Medieval answers to these questions were shaped by the intellectual resources available to them: classical philosophy, Christian theology, folk wisdom, and practical experience. They created sophisticated systems of thought that addressed human needs for explanation, comfort, and guidance. Their beliefs provided frameworks for understanding everything from the movement of the planets to the proper conduct of daily life. The medieval worldview was comprehensive in ways that modern thought often is not. It integrated natural philosophy with moral teaching, political theory with religious doctrine, and practical knowledge with spiritual wisdom. This integration gave medieval life a coherence and meaning that many people find lacking in the fragmented modern world. Medieval beliefs were also communal in ways that modern individualistic culture has difficulty understanding. Truth was not something that individuals discovered for themselves, but something that was revealed through tradition, authority, and collective experience. Knowledge was not private property, but common inheritance that connected the living with the dead and the present with eternity. Continuity of human attempts to understand reality, the transformation of medieval beliefs into modern knowledge, did not represent a complete break with the past, but rather a gradual evolution of human attempts to understand reality. Many of the questions that motivated medieval thinkers continue to challenge contemporary scholars. The methods have changed, but the underlying human drive to comprehend the world remains constant. Modern science, for all its achievements, has not eliminated mystery from human experience, but has simply revealed new forms of mystery. The quantum mechanics that governs atomic behavior is no less strange than medieval beliefs about sympathetic magic. The vast scales of cosmic time and space that modern astronomy has revealed are no less overwhelming than medieval visions of eternity. The complexity of genetic codes and neural networks that modern biology has discovered is no less intricate than medieval theories about the correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm. Contemporary debates about consciousness, free will, and the nature of reality echo medieval discussions about the relationship between body and soul, divine providence, and human choice, and the ultimate nature of existence. Modern philosophers struggle with many of the same problems that occupied medieval thinkers, often reaching conclusions that are no more definitive or satisfying. The persistence of these fundamental questions suggests that the human need to understand reality transcends any particular historical period or cultural context. Medieval beliefs represented one chapter in the ongoing human attempt to make sense of existence, a chapter that has ended, but whose themes continue to resonate in new forms. Why studying medieval beliefs matters for understanding ourselves. Study of medieval beliefs is not merely an antiquarian exercise, but an essential component of human self-understanding. By examining how our predecessors thought about the world, we gain perspective on our own assumptions and prejudices. We discover that many beliefs we take for granted are not universal truths, but historical constructions that could be otherwise medieval. Beliefs also reveal the power of worldviews to shape human experience. Medieval people did not simply hold different opinions about natural phenomena. They inhabited a different reality in which angels and demons were as real as trees and stones. Their beliefs created the world they experienced and defined the possibilities for action within that world. This recognition has important implications for understanding contemporary society. Our own beliefs about progress, individualism, scientific materialism, and technological solutions to human problems are not inevitable consequences of human reason, but historical developments that shape our experience in particular ways. Like medieval beliefs, they have both enabling and limiting effects on human possibilities. The study of medieval beliefs also reveals the tragic dimensions of human existence that modern optimism often ignores. Medieval people understood that human knowledge is limited, that suffering is inevitable, and that death is universal. Their beliefs provided resources for coping with these realities that modern secular culture has struggled to replace. Yet medieval beliefs also demonstrate the human capacity for creating meaning, beauty, and community even under the most difficult circumstances. The cathedrals, universities, and works of art that medieval civilization produced represent extraordinary achievements of human creativity and collaboration. They show what is possible when people share common beliefs and work together toward transcendent goals. The danger of intellectual arrogance across time periods. Perhaps the most important lesson to be drawn from the study of medieval beliefs is the danger of intellectual arrogance and historical chauvinism. Every age tends to assume that its own beliefs are obviously correct and that previous generations were ignorant or deluded. Medieval thinkers were as confident in their worldview as we are in ours, and they had what seemed to them compelling reasons for their beliefs. The Enlightenment criticism of medieval superstition was itself based on assumptions about reason, progress, and human nature that subsequent history has called into question. The 20th century's experience of totalitarianism, world wars, And environmental destruction has revealed the dark side of Enlightenment confidence in human reason and technological progress. The scientific materialism that replaced medieval religious worldviews has produced its own forms of alienation, meaninglessness, and despair. This does not mean that all worldviews are equally valid or that we should abandon the attempt to distinguish truth from falsehood. Rather, it suggests that we should approach the beliefs of other times and cultures with humility, recognizing that our own perspectives are historically conditioned and potentially mistaken. We should be willing to learn from the past while acknowledging its limitations. The medieval experience also warns us against the dangers of suppressing dissent and enforcing orthodoxy. The persecution of heretics and the censorship of dangerous ideas, while motivated by genuine concern for social stability and spiritual welfare, ultimately impoverished intellectual life and delayed important discoveries. Contemporary societies that claim to value truth and freedom must resist the temptation to silence voices that challenge prevailing orthodox, i.e. as dot, at the same time. The medieval synthesis reminds us that purely critical and skeptical approaches to knowledge have their own limitations. The modern emphasis on doubt and questioning, while necessary for scientific progress, can also lead to cynicism and nihilism. The medieval conviction that truth exists and can be known, even if imperfectly, provided a foundation for intellectual inquiry that pure skepticism cannot match. The ultimate lesson of medieval beliefs may be that human beings are storytelling creatures who require comprehensive narratives to make sense of their experience. Medieval Christianity provided such a narrative, a story that began with creation, continued through fall and redemption, and concluded with final judgment. This story gave meaning to individual lives by placing them within a cosmic drama of ultimate significance. Modern secular culture has struggled to develop equally compelling narratives that can provide direction and purpose to human existence. The scientific story of evolution and cosmic development, while true as far as it goes, does not address questions of value and meaning that are central to human experience. The political narratives of progress and liberation, while inspiring to some, have proven divisive and often destructive when pursued with religious fervor. Perhaps what we need is not a return to medieval beliefs, but a recovery of the medieval, understanding that human beings require both rational knowledge and meaningful narrative, both critical thinking and reverent wonder, both individual freedom and communal belonging. The challenge is to create new syntheses that honor both the achievements of modern knowledge and the enduring needs of the human spirit. The story of medieval beliefs is ultimately the story of human beings struggling to understand their place in a mysterious and often frightening universe. Their solutions may no longer satisfy us, but their questions remain our questions. Their failures can teach us as much as their successes. Their example reminds us that the pursuit of truth is not just an intellectual exercise, but a moral and spiritual quest that engages the whole human person. In studying medieval beliefs, we encounter not alien superstitions, but alternative attempts to address the permanent challenges of human existence. We discover that the people of the past were not so different from ourselves. They faced the same fundamental questions, experienced the same hopes and fears, and struggled with the same limitations of knowledge and understanding that we face today. This recognition should inspire both humility about our own achievements and respect for the accomplishments of our predecessors. It should encourage us to learn from the past while working to build a better future. Most importantly, it should remind us that the quest for truth and meaning is a continuing human enterprise that connects us with all those who have gone before and all those who will come after. The medieval world may have ended, but the human search for understanding continues. The beliefs that once seemed so certain have given way to new forms of knowledge that may themselves prove temporary. But the underlying human drive to comprehend reality, to find meaning in existence, and to live purposeful lives remains as strong as ever. In that sense, we are all inheritors of the medieval quest, participants in the same eternal human struggle to make sense of our mysterious and wonderful world.